So it's a delight to have your work on the table today, Lauren. I had the pleasure of kind of having an earlier discussion with you while paddling on the Potomac River not that long ago, and it's you know, at a moment when all of a sudden, you know, coronavirus and all its permutations is national news. Like, you've been doing very careful multi-species work on this for a long time, and in collaboration with some of the very best coronavirus scientists in the world. So I think you're uniquely positioned in the world of cultural anthropology to have important things to say on the current pandemic, but also the specificity of these camel-human worlds that you're describing. And you know, I read your piece on the camels and MERS infection. In part, you know, these are short pieces. It's a genre that, as cultural anthropologists, we're not really taught to write or even read. But you know, in the Lancet, you're saying some important things, and in part, you know, you're doing some critical histories of science here. You're pointing to these retrospective surveys from 1983 to 1997, showing that in fact there were a lot of exposures, but you have that next sentence in there where you're questioning what they were exposed to. You know, now we know a lot about the different, you know, surface antigens of the spike proteins and the nucleocaspids, and you know, here you're writing a few years ago, just, you know, inviting people to be careful in their kind of accounting of what counts as MERS-CoV and what counts as a coronavirus. So I think, like, embedded even in just that one sentence, we see some interesting critical histories of science. And I think in the context of your broader work on zoonotic tuberculosis and you know, traditional healing practices and in East Africa, in Ethiopia, we're seeing that, you know, this isn't necessarily the disease that's the most important disease in the particular place where you have people and animals that you care about. So I was wondering if you might kind of just start out by situating MERS-CoV in the context of your broader work about camels and healing, and you know, these international surveillance practices and regimes in the context of what that looks like on the ground for people who are concerned with often other diseases that aren't the same ones that the global health community is so focused on right now.
Well, it's nice to be here. It's nice to see you all. Thanks so much, Evan, for the introduction. I'll start out by saying, you know, I'm a medical anthropologist and I've been studying the humanitarian industry mostly for the last 15 years. I started out working for UNICEF and sort of did a PhD in anthropology to satisfy all of the lingering questions that I continue to have working at UNICEF. And I have a book coming out soon with Cornell about the local humanitarian industry. And it was sort of from that vantage point, having sort of lived with people who are experiencing humanitarian crises and recurrent interventions, like Doctors Without Borders flies in and then they leave, and UNICEF comes in and then they leave. It was within this context, one of the constants for people was life with their animals, and in and out of different humanitarian crises and sort of forced displacements, they always had their animals with them. And they were always sort of counting on the savings accounts that these large livestock provided through the years. And of course, as a result of that, people were as concerned about livestock health as they were human health, because, I mean, there really was no sort of easy distinction between the two. You know, for example, Somalis love camels and they love the traditional nomadic pastoralist lifeway, and they see themselves and their camels sort of existing sort of symbiotically in their environment. And so they drink the camel milk and they eat the camel meat in order to obtain the highest quality nutrients from the natural environment, from the trees, from the shrubbery, from the water, from everything. And so it is sort of through these sort of symbiotic sort of consumption of animals that sort of Somalis sort of have this constant. I mean, that is their life. Even when they're displaced and living in camps, or even when they go to work in a city, it is always in search of the fresh camel milk that they go. And it was a realization, you know, while studying the humanitarian industry as I was, I had to confront the priorities that, you know, people really have. And those were their priorities. So I started building local collaborations to think through the diseases that were important to people. And one of the most important has been tuberculosis for a long time. You know, Somalis, ethnic Somalis, and other Ethiopian ethnic groups and other groups in the Horn have extraordinarily low rates of HIV. We'll just start. And usually when we think about tuberculosis, you think about populations with high prevalence of HIV, having TB as an important comorbidity and cause of death. But Somalis in particular, and other Ethiopians too, they had very high rates of tuberculosis in the population without accompanying HIV. And so, you know, that was something that was of primary concern to people, and it had killed a lot of people, and treatment regimes were very important. And so I began actually with this concern about, well, where are people getting tuberculosis? And I think that was the first time that I started thinking about incorporating a zoonotic disease as one topic in my research. So I began with zoonotic tuberculosis, hypothesizing that perhaps the source of infection is in the consumption of raw livestock milk, unpasteurized livestock milk. And that is sort of what led to an initial survey. And then meeting zoonotic epidemiologists here in Washington, DC, we started thinking about MERS coronavirus because it was in the news. The first outbreak was in 2012, but there were nosocomial outbreaks the last few years while we were writing our grants. So the idea was to sort of try to uncover the source of MERS-CoV spillover, hypothesizing again that it could potentially be with human, livestock, and other wildlife exposures. And I can go into more detail.
Please, yeah, and that was actually my follow-up question. Give us more details about MERS-CoV. I mean, you know, everyone's kind of heard about it, and, you know, until talking with you while we were paddling that day, I didn't really realize that there were hospital infections in, I think you said Korea?
Yes, yeah, South Korea.
Tell us about this complicated, like, there's no camels in Korea, but like, so, at least as far as I know.
Right. Well, I mean, I think the issue was, and I'm not an expert on MERS, human epidemiology of MERS, but it did spill over from camels to humans in the Gulf states, and then it traveled from humans to humans from there. And so there were cases in Canada, and there were cases in South Korea. And people were hospitalized for the infection, and so there were small nosocomial outbreaks in South Korea and other places, mostly in South Korea, and that's where most of the concern had been. But I mean, it sort of highlights the quick global transit of not just people, but also animals, because the initial spillovers happened with species of camels that are exported out of East Africa to the Gulf states. So, which is why, you know, I was sort of, I was contacted by epidemiologists who were interested in the potential for spillover in Africa prior to the export of either meat or live animals. I mean, but what's interesting, I love your group. I love the sort of people who are thinking multi-species. We actually designed our National Science Foundation grant to study MERS ecology. We designed it to be grounded in a multi-species commodity chain network, or a commodity network analysis. So we were sort of merging an actor network analysis with the idea of multi-species ethnography alongside this sort of commodity chain idea. And so sort of methodologically, what we're doing is we're looking at two commodity chains of camels. One is sort of the traditional Somali market. So they're raised in rural areas and they're finally exported through ports along the Red Sea, et cetera, to go to the Gulf states. And then there was this emergent economy. And this is, you know, based on sort of long-term ethnographic work. I mean, people have been displaced and the arable land for farming has been reduced, and there's been a lot of ethnic conflict around some of the regional boundaries. So what has happened is people who herd camels, they're having to graze them and herd them in different places. And now increasingly they're grazing and herding within national parks, which has meant, of course, that there are potentially new and more frequent interfaces with wildlife. And aside from bats, we're really focusing on different types of animals. So both larger ungulates, wild ungulates, as well as insect-eating mammals like shrews and hedgehogs. They have these miniature hedgehogs, which are adorable. And so we were sort of hypothesizing that along these emergent and traditional commodity chains of camels moving through Ethiopia, that you would have human, livestock, wildlife interfaces along each one. So if you go in and you test sort of the camels, the other livestock, the humans who are in touch with them or close to them, and then also the wildlife that are living with them or living in close proximity to them, that you can get a sense of MERS prevalence along both of these commodity chains. And our sort of driving hypothesis was that this new emergent camel economy, which is a product of conflict and displacement, that emerging economy will increase the chances for spillover, that these sort of new grazing and herding areas present points of sort of spillover and trigger. So that's our study.
It's super interesting and important work. And I mean, I know this because we've been talking, but like it's now sort of on hold because of the related coronavirus pandemic. But it seems, I don't know, it seems so urgent to do right now. And for folks who are just joining us for the first time, I can't see everybody because I can see Lauren's speaker view. But if you have a question, just unmute yourself or put something in the chat. But yeah, this new is, does anyone have, I'll just pause there and see if anyone wants to jump in. I've got more questions.
Oh, Melanie, you go first.
Cool, thank you so much. Thanks for the very interesting papers. Since you mentioned national parks, I'm going to ask, I'm going to start my question there. Because in one of the papers, the one on zoonotic tuberculosis, there's a photograph, and I think that must be, I mean, there's a SANPark, South African National Park Service ranger on it, so I guess that picture was taken in a national park. So I'm curious about the historical dimension of this. I mean, you write a lot about the need to study the social and ecological environment, but what about the historical, a bit more of the history of zoonotic TB, like when did it become a problem, and how is it related to the colonial histories of these regions, like the formation of national parks, the dispossession of lands, etc.
That's a good question. First, I want to say that the picture in the Lancet tuberculosis, the one on zoonotic TB, that's the only picture that's not mine. That was the Lancet editors like adding in a random picture, I think. I'm trying to remember now. The one of the woman holding the camel milk, and those are pictures that I took with my phone. But the yeah, so that's not, and that's I complained about it actually. I said that's not happening here. But so first I want to say that was their desire to put that picture in. But I want to separate again the sort of MERS study from the zoonotic tuberculosis. With MERS, we're hypothesizing that increased grazing and herding inside national parks may be contributing to sort of the increasing prevalence over the course of camels' life to MERS. That, I think, has to be separated from the zoonotic tuberculosis, which has long been an issue in the Horn of Africa. I mean, they've had very high rates of tuberculosis, but the problem has been there is no testing out there. I don't have any historical data, and I'm not sure that the blood banks would be available for zoonotic tuberculosis the way they are for MERS. But there's been so precious little attention to why people actually get TB in the Horn of Africa that it's upsetting that we still don't know. I think I was a bit indignant that there was so little data available, and also there's little clinical testing done for patients either. Only in the last 5 years have you been able to get a decent TB test that will run, you know, both sort of a resistance test as well as to find out what kind of tuberculosis it is. But not all patients will get that. And those are patients who are presenting to the major government hospital in the capital city of the Somali region of Ethiopia. People who can't access those clinical facilities won't get tested at all. And so there's a huge gap in testing. And it does require molecular tests. It cannot be done cheaply. And so far, they don't have the laboratory facilities outside the major labs in Ethiopia, which are closer to the capital city, to do the kind of testing that would, that would reveal sort of what kind of tuberculosis people have. So these are really different questions, and I want to separate those out. But the main sort of barrier we have to understanding tuberculosis among Somalis and other pastoralist groups is a consequence of lack of testing. Does that start to answer? Oh, and you were asking about like colonial histories. I actually don't know. One thing that I think is important to study with ethnic Somalis in particular is the not just colonial history, but the history of partition. So they were partitioned among 4 colonial era empires, including the Ethiopian Empire. And so the lines of partition have meant that people have trouble accessing clinical and testing facilities in other countries, even though they sort of live in a somewhat cohesive greater Somalia. Yeah, so that's a can of worms kind of question too, so.
So I think I see Cesar's hand. I think, were there other hands that I missed earlier? Did you want to say something, Rachel? I think you're muted.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Thanks, Lauren. I'm interested in the food safety dimension just because I work in the food world. And so I'm curious, I mean, on the one hand, there's this kind of juxtaposition of extremes of, you know, highly industrialized food industries and, you know, critiques that we've talked about in this group and outside of this group about, you know, increasing antimicrobial resistance and all sorts of problematic labor dynamics and things like that. And then there's also this sort of like food safety, food dynamic, especially when it comes to interventions into informal food economies and or street level food economies. So I'm kind of interested, I'm curious about your take on this. And the question that I think I'd like to pose, or the way I'd like to frame it for you, is what culturally appropriate food safety kind of initiatives or interventions or measures do you see available, or do you see there being interest in? I love that you kind of frame the non-pasteurized resources as traditionally important, and you frame them within the contexts in which they experienced and lived, and I think that's a wonderful aspect of your work that kept coming back. But I'm just curious, what kind of culturally appropriate measures do you see given what you're calling for?
So this was a huge sort of problematic for me, I think, especially a few years ago when I was first getting involved in this. So the traditional sort of milk economy is actually run by women for the most part. The informal economy. The grazing and herding is often done by men, but when it comes to selling milk and distributing milk, it's done primarily by Somali women. And Somali women, I mean, they're, it's quite a feminist culture actually, because women own a lot. They're empowered. They have the right to divorce. They have the right to separate. They own a lot of property. And so it's difficult to imagine the industrialization of livestock milk without seeing the power going from women who control the informal economy into the hands of men who, for the most part, own the factories and work in the factories, at least that I've seen and been in. And there's also a real reluctance on the part of Somalis to say that they want to industrialize their milk industry. Ethiopia years ago had a major TB problem. I don't know the exact years, but there was a lot of zoonotic tuberculosis in the milk supply, which was mostly cattle milk. But the cow's milk was quickly industrialized. The center of that was the capital city. And they have a wonderful, thriving milk industry now that provides milk at very low cost, and it's very safe to drink. So Ethiopia has been sort of an example of what to do in a sort of low-income situation, in a low-income country, how to industrialize milk and improve population health. Somalis see the potential for the industrialization of their milk, especially camel milk. They see that as not just sort of moving from the women's realm into a sort of male-dominated industry, but they also see it as potentially losing, the Somalis will no longer be in control of that part of the economy. And that if camel milk was to be industrialized, that they would no longer sort of reap the benefits of the milk that they currently do. But this is always paralleled with the continuing concern they have with the pasteurization of the milk. And you know, Somalis are not interested in drinking pasteurized camel milk as much as they are sort of raw milk, because of the microbial properties, the effect it has on their digestion, the taste, and the ability to sort of smoke that raw product and use it to produce yogurts and other products. And so there are all of these reasons. I mean, it's sort of intersectional, like it's about gender, and it's about class, and it's about the ethnic conflicts that exist in Ethiopia, who owns the industries, as well as this sort of ethnophysiological concern with pasteurization. And the pasteurized milk is a really different product than unpasteurized milk. And it's used differently, it's stored differently, it's consumed at different levels. And so you have these parallel economies which continue to exist, the informal, run by mostly women, that provides raw, sort of unpasteurized, fresh, and also smoked and other forms of milk to the population. And that's also used for therapeutics. And then you have the sort of growing industrial milk supply. And there are small factories now in Ethiopia, but in other countries in the Horn, which are producing pasteurized camel milk for sale. And you can now buy sort of bottled pasteurized camel milk in most markets in the Horn of Africa, especially where pastoralists reside. But these are really just different products. So that was a complicated answer to your question, I'm sorry.
Super interesting stuff. So Cesar, your hand's been up, and then Adriana and Kevin on the chat.
Lauren, thank you so much. I really enjoyed your papers, and also kind of continuing with Rachel, I was also in the same vein with when you were mentioning the the recipients they are using, and kind of the traditional recipients versus the older ones, which would be smoked, and kind of the changes in materials. And I would like to hear more about that, about how do people perceive those changes, whether it's something that is being kind of adapted unthinkingly, or is it resisted, or how does it work?
It's a good question. I haven't done systematic research on it, so I'm afraid my answers are sort of as a result of conversations and participant observation, but not sort of systematic research. But I mean, I think it's difficult because so many people are now living in camps and cities where they don't have access to the same wood products and gourds and skins that they grew up with. And so there's this nostalgia for the milk we used to drink and the way we used to produce food. And so there's a desire for it, but people don't have they don't have the resources to produce dairy products that way anymore. Most people. But then there are still a lot of people who live outside cities and camps and who can still sort of produce dairy products in this way. And it's seen as the ideal. It should be the staple of every Somali's diet is camel milk sort of produced and consumed regularly. So, I mean, it's hard. I think people recognize that camel milk, especially unpasteurized camel milk, is it's less desirable when it's stored in plastic, and it goes to waste very quickly. So they see that problem. And what I wrote about in the Lancet Infectious Diseases article was something that we had observed and we were very concerned about, and we wanted to publish, hoping that a microbiologist would take us up or a food safety expert would take us up and sort of try to design appropriate interventions to deal with potential food safety issues. But we haven't gone and done it. So if any of you would like to go and study the microbial properties of wood, skin, gourd, and plastic stored milk products, we would love to work with you. But we don't have the answers as to the precise differences between the products using these different kitchen items. But it's changing. I mean, and we have to acknowledge that it's changing, and Somalis are very concerned about it. They taste different. The shelf life is different. Everything is different, and they have the nostalgia for the old way of doing things, but they don't have access to those products anymore. A lot of people. So. Yeah, and Rachel, I'm sorry if I didn't answer your interventions question adequately. I was like, oh, she's also asking about interventions. And I was always so reluctant, though, to sort of make recommendations in a sort of policy-focused way about, we should change and sort of introduce this new technology or, enforce pasteurization, because I recognize it has all of these other economic, political, social ramifications. And I would want Somalis to be in charge of that advocacy, rather than as a sort of even a social scientist coming in and saying, this is problematic, or rather just to present the potential social, political, economic ramifications. Like this is really important for all of us to consider, and sort of watch and see what happened in the regional governments that are Somali run, to see what sort of they were interested in doing, because they're always talking about this, and they're well aware of the value of the informal economy and these unpasteurized products. So I was also standing back in a way and not making policy or intervention recommendations.
Yeah, thanks. I think that really sort of blended well with Cesar's question too. It drew it out more, the culturally appropriate dynamic of it. Thanks.
Yeah, and we haven't had Heather Paxson on here yet, but her stuff on the microbiopolitics of raw milk is obviously bouncing around in my head as we're talking about these things.
Bouncing around in mine too. Yes.
Yeah, cool. I can't wait to read the book. Let's see. So we've got Adriana next.
Hi there. Thank you so much. I know, I see you looking at the squares. I'm over here.
I do. Hello.
Thank you so much for being here. I just had a quick question. I was curious, you argued that the emphasis on TB associated or sort of preventing TB among populations with a high HIV seroprevalence had been to the detriment of sort of attention paid to other sources and other forms of TB. So I was wondering if you could give some examples of that, of how you saw that happening.
Yeah, I mean, you can just look at the funding mechanisms for cutting edge TB testing and treatment work. And it was typically geared to test for and treat Mycobacterium tuberculosis. And those are most prevalent in populations with HIV. And when I was sort of looking for funding, because I'm partnered with the Aklila Lema Pathobiology Institute, which is associated with Addis Ababa University. And we were all sort of looking for funding avenues to get people tested. And to sort of also think about potentially testing the informal milk, the informal economy milk products. And it was so hard. I mean, the technology for testing zoonotic tuberculosis is more difficult. We recognize that. But all of the funding mechanisms, like at USAID with the Gates Foundation and others, and NIH too with the Fogarty Institute, they were really focused on the sort of the Mycobacterium tuberculosis pathogen. So it was challenging, I think, for us to simply even find someone who would think about innovating testing technology for these sort of cases, which are fewer in number. But I was sort of arguing in the Lancet piece and elsewhere that when you think about the numbers, they are quite low, but the testing isn't there. The numbers of zoonotic tuberculosis cases, the numbers are very low, but also the testing is very low. It's very difficult to get. But if you think about people who are potentially at risk of zoonotic tuberculosis, the numbers are much, much higher. It's true in East Africa, where people are reliant on unpasteurized livestock milk as a staple of their diet. But it's also true, you know, elsewhere in Africa, where people are reliant on unpasteurized milk, which is not purchased on the market. And then if you think about the continent of like South Asia and India, there have been a lot of studies of raw livestock milks, including supplies that have zoonotic tuberculosis. And so I think we don't really know the prevalence or the sort of disease burden of zoonotic TB enough to say sort of one way or the other if there should be sort of more attention put on it. So that's where that argument came from. And you know, it's wonderful to have better testing and treatment for Mycobacteria tuberculosis. I mean, I want that. But it felt like there was an overemphasis on populations with high HIV prevalence in Africa, and a sort of lack of attention to what feels like continually marginalized Somalis in East Africa. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
So we've got Kevin, who's got a question that you might want to ask, and then Melanie's added some more references about national parks. And Kevin, if you want to ask your question, I also want to add to the list of like legal, social, cultural differences, herding camels in national parks versus outside, also ecological, and just like, what do these spaces look like? But Kevin, do you want to ask your question?
You basically already asked it. Thank you for being here. Yeah, because I'm totally unfamiliar of national parks and their socio-political and legal implications. So I was wondering, why did they move to national parks or why did they move their camels to national parks, and how was that different for them from the outside? What were the drivers' motives, and what happened there? How did camel herding change when they went to the national parks? And all this kind of contextual information I would be super interested in of hearing. Thanks.
So I'll preface this by saying I'm not a wildlife biologist, and before now I have limited sort of experience looking at the history of national parks in Ethiopia or elsewhere. But I can sort of talk about how it's changed, how especially camel herding has changed. Ethiopia has a long history of protecting national parks throughout the country. They have had several, especially in the central parts of the country, in the north, Simien Mountains. They're beautiful. You should go and see. They're endangered baboons and wolves that are amazing. But there's also in the eastern part of the country, along the Rift Valley, like where the Rift Valley comes down a lot. In the middle of the Rift Valley, there are several protected national park areas. And then even to the east of the Rift Valley, toward as you move toward the coast and toward the Red Sea, there are also protected national parks. It just so happens that these national parks in Ethiopia in particular exist along the borders of the regional states. So for example, Ethiopia is an ethnic federal state, and that has meant since 1991, or really since the Constitution was passed in 1994, that the country has been divided mostly into ethnic-based regions, which is a big problem. And it continues to be the primary reason why there's political insecurity in Ethiopia today. So in the eastern part of the country, you have the Somali region, which borders Djibouti, Somaliland, Somalia, and Kenya. And then you have the Oromo region, which is in the news probably more than anywhere else in Ethiopia. That's where a lot of ethnic Oromos live. And then you have above that, you have the Afar region, which is populated mostly by ethnic Afar Ethiopians. They are also nomadic pastoralists traditionally. And so along each of these regional boundaries, especially between the Somali, Oromo, and Afar region, there's conflict over access to land, over the location of the borders, over who has the right to sell in markets along the roads that go through the borders, and who has access to the natural resources there, such as watering sites. So I'll lay on to that sort of political context that as well there's been climate change in the Horn of Africa. Climate changes in the last 20 years have meant gradual desertification. So the rainfall has declined significantly, especially east of the Rift Valley. And there's a lot of environmental degradation on top of that. So there has been agricultural farming. There's been damming projects, dam projects that dam up the major rivers in this part of the world. And that has also had an effect on the quality of soil and on the ability of grazing and herding animals to live there. So there are changes to the climate, there are changes to the environment, and there are all these political issues. The national parks tend to be, that we're studying, and in the eastern half of Ethiopia, exist along the Rift Valley, which is along those regional boundaries, and moving east to west, sort of also along regional boundaries. So as sort of conflict around these border areas has increased, what has happened is the federal police and the military have moved in to remove pastoralists from traditional grazing and herding land and have them sort of keep their animals elsewhere. This has pushed them into the national parks, which are remote and are underfunded. Gosh, I'm so sorry. Which are remote and which are underfunded, so that the park police, there aren't very many, and they don't do a very good job of monitoring the enormous land that they have. So, and they're also paid off. So what you have are pastoralists and semi-nomadics, both nomadic pastoralists and semi-nomadic pastoralists, who are using these sort of wild spaces at these border regions, and the border is contested, So it's easier to move into some of these national parks than it is to exist in contested traditional grazing and herding areas. And that's why we see sort of people thinking anew about regulating and policing the national parks, but it's also the reason why we chose them as locations to study, because the national parks have had a long history of being protected from livestock and human occupation. So they have better shrub growth, they have better grasses, their water sources haven't been dammed, or they haven't been messed with. So it's really prime sort of grazing areas for people with camels and cattle also. So that's why we're there. But I will also say that when you sort of layer on all of these interesting variables, it makes the project so interesting, and I'm so excited to be part of it. But it has also made it really difficult to actually do the research, because these are along contested regional boundaries. They're in areas that are politically insecure. They're in federally controlled land that people are sort of moving on to without permission. And so it's risky for them. It's risky for us to be identifying them and locating them and studying them, talking to them, because it puts them at risk of sanction or arrest. And a lot of the people who are doing the herding and the grazing of livestock are from ethnic minorities, and they're really vulnerable. They're really vulnerable to sort of regulation by the police and military. So it's been really difficult. It's been really difficult. Yeah.
Thanks. I feel like we're getting, you know, this important knowledge that is so hard to generate. And I mean, I think some of the same bureaucratic logics about vulnerability translate into kind of the silencing of certain kinds of stories. And I think it's really important that you're doing this work. So we've got, so Melanie, you already asked one question. So is it okay if we skip over to Soraya and then Seppi?
Sure. I mean, mine was more a reference.
Cool. So go ahead, Soraya.
I'm happy to go ahead, but it actually seemed to me that Seppi had raised her hand from the very beginning, so maybe she should get first. If she's there. I can't see her just now.
Either way.
Okay, she may have disappeared. Yeah, so thank you. This is very interesting, and you know, I don't know anything about this. So my questions, I have two questions actually. One that can come out just from this current discussion. So it would just be nice if you tell us a little more about your local context, because you have also co-authors, right? So how are they more in the area, and how is your work seen, for instance, by these communities and so on? If you can just tell us a little bit more about that. But my other question was, I just wondered, you know, when reading the Lancet articles, it seems like, you know, the way you talk about this, and I don't know anything about this, but the way you talk about these diseases and infections, it seemed like, you know, this standard way of talking about a disease, you know, you have a test and then you define this is the disease and so on. But I was just wondering if you live with these diseases, if you live with the livestock, you know, on a long-term basis, and there is so this adaptation between the people and the animals, right? So, I mean, the example I had in my mind was this at the very beginning of the history of vaccination. You know, the cows, the people working with the cows and being protected because they had cow tuberculosis and not it was smallpox, right? The cow smallpox, actually just living with them and always being exposed to them low level actually protected them against the smallpox, right? And so this is where the whole idea of immunization got started. So what about living with them, being always in, you know, isn't there a difference? You know, isn't there a difference if when I don't know, get the coronavirus now or whatever? You see what I mean? So living, so yeah. So and how does it change how to think about these pathogens and the diseases? if they are
Those
sort
are
of
really
endemic
good
in a way.
questions. Okay, I'll start with the first one and then I'll go to the second one.
Yeah.
So my role. So I'll talk about the MERS-CoV team because it's sort of set. The people who are studying MERS with me, the lead PI on the study is Amira Roess, who's a zoonotic epidemiologist. She's now at George Mason University. She studied cowpox and other pox before, and other disease systems, but she's never worked in Ethiopia before now. We have a wildlife biologist named Sally Lamb, who began her career studying the spillover of Ebola in Central Africa. In the 1970s, she started. And then she also worked in Sierra Leone subsequently. And then we have John Drake, who is an ecologist and mathematician. And he has a lab at the University of Georgia, which looks at population dynamics. He's fantastic. We have Kristen Drosten and Marcel Muller from Charité Hospital in Berlin, where Eben is. They're the virologists who will be doing the sort of genetic analysis of the samples that we collect. Let me see who else is on there. And we have Michael Mann, who is at George Washington University. He's a geographer. And he has done a lot of work in East Africa, modeling climate changes and its effect on food security and crops. And then we have Mona Atia, who has worked primarily in, I think, Egypt and in North Africa on commodity chain analyses. And she is, I'm trying to think if she's an anthropologist or a social geographer. Yeah, Mona Atia, she's amazing. So there's this team of us. And I sort of came up with this multi-species commodity network analysis method to sort of combine different anthropological methods to sort of look at multi-species interfaces along different commodity chains of camels. So I'm leading the qualitative part. But what it's actually meant for me, Soraya, which is a more interesting question, I think, is that I'm the only person that knows Ethiopia. And I'm the only person who knows about the sort of everyday life of people and their animals, because I lived with them. And it's been very difficult to work with Ethiopian partners. The National Science Foundation sort of doesn't allow you to hand over a lot of the money or power to international partners very often. And they resisted it in this case. The team felt it was unable to partner with any Somalis. And I think, you know, to be really frank with you, it's been hard to push that. I sort of have my own lenses for seeing the way that science is conducted in East Africa, and I see consistently a lack of partnership with Somali universities and Somali scientists, and that continues to this project. Part of the reason is they don't have access to the same university degrees, and that the laboratory facilities in Somali regions and Somali-dominated countries like Djibouti and Somaliland and Somalia and the Somali region in Kenya, that they just have less funding. But this project, it's also unfortunately perpetuated that pattern. It's reproduced it because there has been only a willingness to sort of partner with Ethiopians in the capital city, the major universities there. And then to do testing in Germany rather than sort of invest in coronavirus testing for Ethiopia, which is not a possibility at this point. So, you know, we also have those challenges. And I'm just being honest with the group about that. It's been really difficult to work against that tradition. And unfortunately, I think there is a lack of sort of local partnerships. And, you know, part of the reason is that, you know, before the novel coronavirus hit this last year, there was so much conflict along these border regions in Ethiopia that we had already paused our data collection because we couldn't ensure the safety of the enumerators and the data collectors who were all from the dominant ethnic minority in Ethiopia, which are Amharic speaking Ethiopians, Habesha Ethiopians. They did not hire, the universities that we partnered with in Ethiopia did not hire any locals to do the data collection. And I really wasn't in control of that. So I will add, I know that you guys are, a lot of you are involved in these large international collaborations, but I've really struggled with it because it's really interesting to study a conflict affected place, a politically insecure place, and how pathogens emerge in them in these multi-species environments. But it's also really hard to negotiate meaningful partnerships in those contexts. I'll answer Soraya's, your second question. You're gonna have to remind me because I wasn't able to write it down. What was it? I'm sorry again. You had, oh, you're still on mute. You're still on mute, Soraya, I can't hear you.
My question was about how we understand the pathogens and the diseases when, how is it different? If you live in, how we have to change our understandings of what these diseases are, if they come out of this sort of long-term sort of living with the animals and the herders and the consumer of these products, right? Because there are all kinds of adaptations, I don't know, microbiome adaptations, and I don't know what, that could change how these diseases, you know, so it's something when you go to, you know, when you send your test to Berlin and then they make a diagnosis, but does it matter if this diagnosis actually refers to a situation that could be different? And I made the example of the smallpox, cows and so on. Yeah.
I love this question. I don't know is the answer. But I think there are a few things we have to be really careful of. The first is, you know, we actually have no evidence that there's human disease as a consequence of MERS in the environment, either in animals or livestock. So there is no current evidence that Somalis who are exposed to their camels that do have quite a high seroprevalence of MERS antibodies, that they have any negative effects of it. But I think we have to look at the other side of that, which is this is a group of people that has no disease surveillance, no functional disease surveillance of any kind. And even today, they don't have COVID-19 disease surveillance of any kind. And so if a flu-like disease were to spill over, emerge in pastoralist communities, that we would not know. And I hate to say that, but you know, people have the #1 cause of death, I think, across all age groups is pneumonia. A close second would be diarrheal diseases. And there aren't currently the clinical or laboratory technologies to be able to detect exactly what people have or die of, and that would be sensitive enough to sort of observe the spillover of a new pathogen like this. And I don't want to romanticize this sort of, I think it's a really interesting and valid question that there may be sort of different levels of immunity to different pathogens, including, you know, bacteria as well as viruses. And some, I think, preliminary data has come out that prior exposure to some coronaviruses may increase immunity to others, but I have not seen any clear data of that. And I wouldn't want to use that as a reason to presume that that they sort of have an ability to resist this infection. I think it's much more likely that they are to be affected by a novel pathogen and for it to go undetected, simply because no one is bothering to test Somalis for anything. I hate to say that, but it feels quite true, especially in looking at the incredibly high burden tuberculosis has had for generations, and the complete lack of attention to that disease in particular.
Yeah, but what about the tuberculosis? I mean, is that okay? But someone has to talk. Actually,
well, they have BCG, but yeah, it has. Yeah. Go ahead.
No, I think it should.
So yeah, Sevgi has a question as well, and yeah, this has been super important, Lauren. And what I think what you're just saying is kind of speaking to questions of imperialism in science, and who gets all of a sudden there's an interest in surveilling these populations, but like lack of interest in long-term healthcare provision and attending to diseases that are important. But Sevgi, are you there?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Great. Yep.
Actually, it's quite related with Soria's questions and concerns that I'm wondering, are you, in your research, are you also interested in a scientist group, medical researchers, to gain some insights of their traditional practices, how they engaged with this disease, how they are somehow dealing with disease, how they are perceiving? Are you somehow, do you think it's your scientific researchers are open for this kind of insights? Because I feel this from your paper, it's quite science dominated, and so we are somehow excluding their practices and their knowledges about this disease somehow. Yeah,
that's a good question. We have designed interviews to ask people about this, and to ask very general questions about not just the use of milk, but also perceptions of disease and changes in sort of bodily function and humoral flows and digestion and these things, which in my prior work, I mean, Somalis love to talk about their digestion. So I think it'll yield really interesting results. But I think, yeah, I've experienced there's a whole lot more interest in identifying quantifiable aspects of the multi-species life. So we're collecting sort of ecological data, like how much time do you spend and how much distance from the animals, but it's quite quantifiable. And we're not at the point yet where we can sort of plug in these social ecological variables into the math models. We're just not there yet. So we'll see. I'll talk to you in a couple of years. But I think the most important work I've done is to really, I think, to design the study to begin with. And so as an anthropologist, I think my perspective on the history and on the sort of ethnophysiology of sort of milk consumption and camel life, that has gone into the design of the study, and sort of trying to negotiate local partners. Then it has then it is reflected in the mathematical models. But I mean, part of what this team is interested in doing, I would say John Drake, maybe more than anyone, is interested in having an idea of the place and of the people and of what's happening prior to even designing the surveys and prior to even taking the viral samples. And so where we go, who we take samples from, has been formatively designed using anthropological knowledge. And so, a lot of my work has already been done in sort of designing this project. The sort of integration of the sociocultural variables and the ecological variables into the model, like I said, it won't happen for a while. But we do have those questions that we're asking humans all along these different camel economies. Questions of ethnophysiology and of sort of local definitions of disease. And yeah, so we are doing that. We'll see how it goes.
So thanks so much, Lauren. This is an incredibly generative series of articles. I can't wait for the book. We'll have you back. When is it coming out?
Wait, which, you mean the book?
The Cornell book about NGOs and all that.
Good question. 2021.
Okay, 2021. All right. If the group will still be going, I'm going to be optimistic, or maybe that's pessimistic. The pandemic will still be happening. We'll be hanging out in Zoom again. But yeah, thank you so much for sharing this with us. It's super important work, and I really hope you can get back to do the important field work that is so needed. So thanks for sharing this, and see you soon.
Thank you for your questions. You guys made me think about this in new and different ways, and thank you for posting stuff in the chat. I can't wait to get into this.
Yeah, I saved the chat and emailed it to you. So thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody, and we'll have this video if you want to watch an instant replay of yourself. You can also watch the video. So thanks everyone. See you next week. Rachel, do you want to plug what we got upcoming? I forget what we've got upcoming.
I think it's Stephen or Stepan Muek. His piece.
Stefan Muki, sorry.
Okay,
Stephen Muki.
Sorry, I've never met this poor person whose name I've mutilated here.
Yeah,
and
I can actually pitch it now that you've reminded me. So Stephen Muki is one of the people who invented fictocritical ethnography as kind of a mode of writing, and he's offering us a speculative fiction piece about a writer sitting at a desk getting a virus. It's really thoughtful, engaging with all kinds of really good philosophy. Highly recommended. So next week at a time that's friendly to Australia, probably not friendly to LA though, but can't have everybody in the same Zoom room. All right, thanks again, Lauren, and hope to see you back in Maryland soon.
Bye everyone.
Bye everybody.
Bye, stay safe.